GR-75 transport is undoubtedly the logistical backbone of the Alliance. These unusual ships are a near ubiquitous sight in bases and fleets, providing nearly all the cargo and personnel transportation for the Alliance. But what isn't as well known is that the GR-75 wasn't always meant to be such a utilitarian ship. If we look at the Empire Strikes Back sketchbook, we can see that the original artists themselves intended the GR-75 to be a passenger liner that was completely hollowed out and converted into a container carrier. And while this intention has been unfortunately lost in the current lore, I'd say that regardless of what the current canon says, this original backstory is pretty obvious with the visual design alone. We don't need a reference book to see that these ragged edges suggest crudely removed hull paneling, and how the curved hull suggests that a more elegant and civilized vessel had been repurposed for a less glamorous role. Ever since hearing about this ship's history as a passenger liner, I've wondered what it might have looked like fresh off the assembly line. By filling in the gaps and injecting a little bit of my own creativity, this is what I came up with: the Gallifrey GR-75 Starliner. I would place this ship some 10 or 15 years before the Clone Wars, and I imagine Gallifrey yards would attempt to make the smallest possible long-range passenger liner, marketing the GR-75 as the perfect starship to fit in between smaller, low-cost transports that offered little beyond a single seat to passengers, and huge passenger liners like those of the Mon Calamari, whose starships were loaded with lavish and difficult-to-maintain facilities. This meant that the GR-75 could remain compact enough to operate out of almost any spaceport, but just barely large enough to offer proper accommodations to a respectable number of passengers. Individual operators could outfit their starliners with different sorts of interior layouts, but here we see a GR-75 operated by Londayar Starlines, which aim to offer long-range services to passengers who were essentially moving their entire lives to new planets. As such, these passengers might have lots of cargo and could book a cargo container along with their fare. These starliners would make long circuits around Republic space, picking up and dropping off passengers as they went. Depending on where you got on and where you were going, passengers could expect to spend a relatively long time on the ship, so accommodations, though tight, were much less limited than they often were on smaller transports. While private first-class cabins with viewports were available, the majority of passengers would find their personal accommodations center around a number of passenger hub modules. These dormitory-style accommodations would offer little in privacy, but every passenger would have access to a bunk and personal storage, as well as a variety of communal facilities. Unfortunately, Gallifrey's gamble of creating a budget starliner meant that the GR-75 was never particularly well suited for its intended role. It was far too expensive to operate as a low-cost passenger transport, and it was simply not large enough to operate as a proper starliner. As such, only a small number of companies managed to operate successful passenger routes using the GR-75, with the majority of these ships actually remaining unsold in Gallifrey sales lots across the galaxy. Desperate to make any sort of return, Gallifrey would start selling the GR-75 stripped of most of its amenities at an enormous discount. While this ultimately wouldn't actually help the company much, the resulting subculture of spacers heavily modifying these ships to fill all sorts of different roles would last well beyond the end of Gallifrey as a company shortly into the Imperial era. It was soon discovered that with the right modifications, the GR-75 made an excellent cargo ship, but unfortunately could never publicly operate as such with the Empire's zealous licensing requirements and restrictions on commerce. Consequently, these illegally modified starships would find their way into the hands of individuals and groups who already operated outside or against the Empire. The ever-growing alliance to restore the Republic would further maximize the carrying capacity of the GR-75 by removing the spacious bridge complex and replacing it with a cramped one-man cockpit. Propelled by newly souped-up engines, these improvised barges were faster than almost any cargo vessel of similar size on the market, so the GR-75 would prove to be one of the most valuable ships in the Alliance fleet. The Alliance would also use a limited number of these vessels as blockade runners. The ship's original hull design had already excelled at deflecting glancing blows, so equipping additional armor and shielding could grant the GR-75 surprising survivability in very short entanglements. But even when the GR-75 was serving in combat roles, it was largely employed as an action rescue ship. Alliance engagements often required jumping into Imperial-controlled space, hitting a target, and jumping out, meaning that the only time to retrieve escape vehicles was during the fighting itself. This critical role often fell on the GR-75, which, under protection from dedicated starfighter wings, would weave around the combat zone, evacuating crippled ships and making use of its exposed ventral bay to rapidly retrieve escape pods and starfighter ejection modules. Altogether, the GR-75 would be an indispensable asset to the Alliance, filling multiple roles in the fleet. Though the work of the GR-75 was often thankless, it would prove critical in the fight to restore the Republic and to return the galaxy to a state where, with some luck, the GR-75 and ships like it could once again return to more elegant peacetime duties. Ships like the GR-75 Starliner or the Imperial Nebulon B occupy a really interesting category of ships that have technically existed in lore, but were never officially depicted. And I'd be curious if there are other ships in this category that you'd like to see. I love making these sorts of videos, but they are huge projects that take weeks or months of work. So I'd like to give a big thank you to every one of my amazing supporters on Patreon, whose continued patronage makes it possible to produce these videos at all. So if that sounds like something that you would like to be a part of, head on over to Patreon. But regardless, I'm just glad you're here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.